Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I will continue telling you the story of James and Diep. James had never thought there would come a day when he would have to face his father like this. That morning, he stepped out of the house with the decision already made. No hesitation, no turning back. Because if the silence continued, the one who would be hurt the most would not be him, but Diep. Beside James was CEO Hung. It was not by chance that he was present at this meeting. Hung understood that things had gone too far, and if no one stepped in to set boundaries, silence would continue to be used as a tool of control. Their purpose was very clear. They would meet the father, not to argue, not to ask for permission, but to say what James had suppressed for many years. All this time, the father had believed that he was acting for the sake of the family. But it was precisely that belief that had made Diep the one who endured the most. This meeting was not simply a family conversation. It was the final boundary between continuing to remain silent or standing up to protect the woman who had endured for far too long. James knew that from the moment he stepped into that room, the father-son relationship would no longer be the same. But if he did not do this, he would lose himself as well. The door was about to open, and no one knew whether after this meeting, that family would fall apart or finally begin to change. The meeting took place in a small private room. The space was simple, the lighting dim, but the atmosphere was heavy from the very first moment. James entered first. CEO Hung followed. No one spoke, but both of them knew clearly the purpose of this meeting. This was not a social conversation, nor was it a negotiation. This was the first time James faced his father directly to make one thing clear. Everything had gone beyond the limit. When the father appeared, the silence in the room immediately became tense. His gaze still carried its familiar authority, as if he had never imagined he would be questioned. For many years, he had always been the one to make the final decisions, and those decisions, in his view, were all for the benefit of the family. James looked at his father. This time, he did not lower his head. He began to speak directly to the point. No circling around, no avoidance. He mentioned Diep, the woman who had endured for far too long under the pressure of unspoken judgments and invisible control. His words did not need to be loud, but they were clear enough to leave no room for misunderstanding. The father reacted immediately. He insisted that he was only protecting the family, that all his actions stemmed from the responsibility of a father. He did not accept being questioned, and even less did he accept being accused of hurting others. At that moment, CEO Hung spoke up. He did not attack, but every sentence was firm. He emphasized that protection is not the same as control, and that no one has the right to cause others to suffer in the name of family. He stated clearly that boundaries had been crossed for far too long, and that the consequence of silence was wounds that only grew deeper. The exchange grew more intense. The words back and forth were no longer just opinions, but a direct confrontation between two perspectives: old authority and new boundaries. James understood that from this moment on, there was no turning back. He had chosen to stand by Diep. Even if it meant damaging the father-son relationship, he could no longer remain silent. This confrontation did not only determine Diep's fate, but also forced everyone in the room to face themselves. When CEO Hung finished speaking, the room fell into silence once again. But this time, it was no longer the tense silence of confrontation, but a space waiting to be filled with truth. James took a deep breath. He knew that if he didn't speak now, he might never have the courage again. He did not begin with accusations. He spoke about Diep. His voice slowed, grew lower. Each sentence was like a carefully placed memory, not meant to hurt anyone, only to no longer be hidden. He talked about how Diep often chose silence, not because she didn't feel the pain, but because she always believed that speaking up would make everything worse. She was used to enduring, used to telling herself that if she just tried a little harder, everything would be fine. James spoke of very small things, so small that the person who caused them might not remember, but the one who received them would remember for a very long time. A judging look, a careless remark that diminished her, a gesture of disregard hidden beneath the guise of concern for the family. No need to shout, no need to insult. Repeated often enough, those things alone were enough to make a person begin to doubt their own worth. James spoke of nights when Diep said she was fine, but her eyes were tired. Of meals where she sat in silence, listening to others talk about her life as if she were not even there. Of moments when she chose to smile to keep the peace, while inside she had long grown used to feeling diminished. These things are not rare in everyday life. Many people, especially women, grow up believing that endurance is a virtue, that love means bearing things silently, and that if they stay quiet long enough, others will eventually understand. But reality is often not like that. James did not blame anyone. He simply spoke, steadily and clearly. And it was precisely that calmness that made each of his words heavier than any accusation. The father frowned slightly. He seemed to want to argue, to interrupt, to defend what he still believed was right. But then he fell silent. Perhaps because for the first time, he did not hear anger in his son's voice, but only exhaustion. A very familiar exhaustion, of those who have endured for too long and no longer want to win, only to be understood. Outside, life continued. Voices talking, cars passing by, ordinary sounds of daily life. But inside that room, each word James spoke was opening the first cracks in the wall the father had built over many years. And once the truth has been spoken, no one can pretend they have never heard it. After James stopped speaking, the room sank into a very different kind of silence. No longer tense like when they first walked in, no longer confrontational. Instead, it was a heavy stillness, as if the words that had just been spoken were still hanging in the air, waiting for someone to touch them. The father sat quietly. His face no longer carried its familiar confidence. The features that had once been so rigid now softened, revealing a weariness he had tried to hide for many years. He said nothing, but the hands resting on the table tightened slightly, a reflex of someone being forced to look directly at something he had always avoided. He was used to giving orders, used to being listened to without having to listen himself. Throughout his life as a father, as the one in charge, he had always believed he knew what was best. But for the first time, that belief no longer felt certain. Hung observed carefully. He did not continue speaking. He understood that there are moments when words are no longer necessary. What matters is allowing the truth to find its own way into someone's heart. James also remained silent. He was not waiting for an apology. He had learned that some changes do not come through words, but through the moment when someone stops resisting. And his father's silence now, though not yet an admission, was no longer denial. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, cold and indifferent. Each sound seemed to remind them that time does not stop for anyone, and that there are wounds that quietly accumulate over years, longer than any argument. Outside the window, life continued as if nothing had happened. A vendor was packing up a stall. A child was laughing with a friend. Those familiar scenes stood in stark contrast to the emotional storm unfolding inside the small room. At last, the father sighed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a heavy breath, as if he had set down part of an invisible burden on his shoulders. He did not apologize. He did not defend himself. But he did not attack anymore. And sometimes, that very moment, the moment someone chooses not to continue causing harm, is the greatest change of all. The confrontation was not over. Nothing had been fully resolved. But from this moment on, no one in the room could return to the old silence where everything was buried as if it had never existed. A crack had appeared, and light, however faint, had begun to seep in. The meeting ended without any clear declaration. No one stood up victorious, and no one left defeated. There was only the truth laid bare, raw and heavy, like something that had been buried for too long and was now forced into the light. The father left the room alone. Outside, everything went on as usual. The street was still noisy. People were buying and selling, talking, laughing. Life did not slow down just because one family was facing old wounds. And that was what made him suddenly realize a cold truth. Life does not wait for anyone to resolve their conflicts before moving on. He walked slowly, his eyes passing over scenes that were so familiar yet suddenly felt strange. A vendor carefully packing up a stall. A mother calling her child home for lunch. An old man stopping to rest at a street corner. Images so simple that he had never paid them any attention. But today, they seemed to strike him directly, reminding him of the small things he had missed for many years. In his mind, James's words echoed, quiet, without accusation, yet persistent. Then the calm gaze of CEO Hum. And finally, the image of Diep, the woman he had once viewed with suspicion and prejudice without ever truly trying to understand her. For the first time in a very long while, he did not think about power, position, or whether he had been right or wrong as the one in charge. He thought about family meals that had once been full, now reduced to silence. He thought about the son who had once looked at him with admiration, and how that gaze had gradually grown distant. He stopped in front of a window, watching people pass by. Suddenly, a thought rose that made his throat tighten. Perhaps I was wrong. He said it very softly, almost only enough for himself to hear. It was not a complete confession, nor an apology, but it was the first time he allowed himself to question the certainties he had clung to his entire life. In everyday life, deep changes rarely come through dramatic moments. They begin with very small, very fragile questions, yet one strong enough to shake an entire old system of beliefs. The father stood there for a long while. He understood that nothing was finished yet, but he also understood that from this moment on, he could no longer continue living as he had before. Something had awakened. Slowly, belatedly, but irreversibly. The next morning, the father woke up very early. He had barely slept. The images and words from the previous day kept repeating in his mind, not loudly, but relentlessly, like an old melody one cannot stop humming. The kitchen was the same. The cup of coffee on the table had gone cold, yet he still sat there, watching the morning light slip through the window and fall on familiar surfaces. A completely ordinary morning. And it was precisely that ordinariness that made him realize something important. He had spent his whole life winning battles outside, yet lost the most important battle of all, the battle with his own family. He now understood where he had gone wrong, but understanding did not mean knowing what to do next. Because returning is not just about opening a door. It is about accepting to step through it in a different role. Did he have enough courage to return as a father? Please watch the next episode. And if you would like to continue accompanying stories about family, about silence, healing, and very human choices like these, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for staying until the very end.